On March 22, 1943, in the village of Khatyn, Belarus, 75-year-old Iosef Kaminsky held his son in his arms as German soldiers surrounded the villagers. Everyone, all 149 residents, including 75 children, had been herded into the largest barn in the village. The soldiers nailed the doors shut from the outside, piled straw around the barn, and poured gasoline over everything. Then they lit it on fire. Inside the barn, people screamed as flames engulfed the wooden structure. The heat became unbearable. Children cried for their mothers. Families clung to each other. Then, in a desperate attempt to survive, the villagers managed to break down the front doors. People poured out, gasping for air, their clothes on fire. But SS soldiers and Ukrainian collaborators stood waiting with machine guns. They opened fire immediately. Bodies fell in the doorway. Mothers carrying babies were shot and fell back into the flames. Children who tried to run were cut down by bullets. Iosef Kaminsky's son, who had been wounded in the initial shooting, died in his arms. When the massacre ended, 149 people were dead, burned alive, shot, or suffocated by smoke. The village's 26 houses were then looted and set on fire. By evening, Khatyn had ceased to exist. If this story makes your blood run cold, if you cannot imagine the horror of being burned alive or watching your children die, then like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below. Share this so these victims are never forgotten. Because Khatyn was not an isolated incident. It was one of 628 Belarusian villages that were completely destroyed with all inhabitants killed. Now let me take you back to March 1943 to understand how an entire village was erased in a single afternoon.
To understand the Khatyn massacre, we must first understand the horrific scale of Nazi atrocities in Belarus during World War II. Belarus suffered one of the highest civilian death rates of any nation during the war, with over 2 million people killed out of a pre-war population of approximately 9 million, nearly 1/4 of the entire population. This staggering death toll was the result of systematic Nazi policies of extermination, retaliation, and terror. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Belarus was one of the first territories to fall under German occupation. The region was strategically important, located between Germany and Moscow, and contained vital railways and supply routes. But it was also heavily forested, with vast swamps and difficult terrain, perfect conditions for partisan warfare. By 1942, Soviet partisan groups had established themselves throughout Belarus, conducting guerrilla operations against German forces. They ambushed convoys, destroyed railways, assassinated German officials, and disrupted supply lines. The partisans enjoyed significant support from the local population, who provided food, shelter, and intelligence. This support made the partisans highly effective, but also brought devastating consequences to Belarusian villages. The German response to partisan activity was brutal and indiscriminate. Rather than trying to distinguish between partisans and civilians, Nazi commanders implemented a policy of collective punishment. Any village suspected of aiding partisans would be completely destroyed, and all inhabitants would be executed. This policy was designed to terrorize the population into withdrawing support from the partisans, but instead it drove more people to join the resistance. The scale of village destruction in Belarus was unprecedented. At least 5,295 Belarusian settlements were burned and destroyed by the Nazis during the occupation. In the Vitebsk region alone, 243 villages were burned down twice, 83 villages were burned 3 times, and 22 villages were burned 4 or more times. In the Minsk region, 92 villages were burned twice, 40 villages 3 times, 9 villages 4 times, and 6 villages 5 or more times. Of these thousands of destroyed villages, 628 were completely annihilated along with all their inhabitants, meaning every man, woman, and child was killed, and the villages were never rebuilt. These 628 villages simply disappeared from the map, their names surviving only in memorial records. Khatyn was one of these 628 villages. Located about 50 kilometers north of Minsk in the Hoysk district, Khatyn was a small farming village of just 26 houses and 157 registered inhabitants. The villagers were primarily Belarusian peasants who worked the land, raised livestock, and lived in traditional wooden houses. The village had existed for centuries, and its residents knew each other intimately. They were neighbors, relatives, and friends. On the morning of March 22, 1943, a German convoy was traveling along the road near Khatyn when it was ambushed by Soviet partisans. The attack killed several German soldiers, including Hans Wolke, an SS Hauptsturmtreffer, a captain who had been a famous Olympic athlete before the war. He had won a gold medal in shot put at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. His death particularly enraged the German command. The ambush was carried out by partisans who then disappeared back into the forests. They were not from Khatyn, and the village itself had not been directly involved in the attack. But under Nazi collective punishment policy, proximity to partisan activity was enough to condemn an entire community. Within hours, a punitive force was assembled. To retaliate, the force consisted of members of the Schutzmannschaft Battalion 118, a collaborationist unit composed primarily of Ukrainian auxiliaries serving under German command. These units were notorious for their brutality and were often used for anti-partisan operations and village destruction because German commanders wanted to avoid using regular Wehrmacht troops for such atrocities. The battalion was commanded by German SS officers, but the actual killing was largely carried out by the Ukrainian collaborators. This use of collaborators was deliberate. It allowed the Germans to distance themselves from the worst atrocities and to sow ethnic hatred between different Soviet peoples. On the afternoon of March 22, 1943, the Punishment Battalion arrived in Khatyn. The soldiers surrounded the village, blocking all escape routes. They went door to door, dragging out every resident they could find: men, women, children, infants, and the elderly. Some villagers were working in fields and were rounded up there. Others were in their homes and were forced out by gunpoint.
As the soldiers of Schutzmannschaft Battalion 118 rounded up Khatyn's residents, terror spread through the village. Families were torn from their homes, elderly people were dragged into the street, and children cried as armed men shouted orders in languages they didn't understand. The soldiers herded everyone toward the center of the village, using rifle butts and bayonets to force compliance. Anyone who resisted or moved too slowly was beaten. Within an hour, 149 people had been gathered, nearly the entire population of the village. Among them were 75 children under the age of 16, including infants and toddlers. There were elderly grandparents, pregnant women, and disabled residents who could barely walk. They stood in the cold March air, confused and terrified, not yet understanding what was about to happen. The soldiers then marched the villagers to the largest barn in Khatyn, a sturdy wooden structure used for storing hay and grain. The barn was approximately 30 meters long and could hold significant amounts of agricultural produce. But on this day, it would serve a different, horrific purpose. The soldiers forced all 149 villagers into the barn at gunpoint. Families clung to each other, mothers held babies, the elderly were helped by younger relatives. The barn quickly became crowded, with people pressed together in the confined space. Then the soldiers slammed the barn doors shut and nailed them closed from the outside. Heavy planks were hammered across the entrance to prevent anyone from escaping. Inside the barn, the villagers realized they were trapped. Some began to panic. Others tried to remain calm, especially parents, attempting to comfort terrified children. But as they heard the soldiers moving around outside, dragging materials and shouting orders, dread began to set in. Outside, the
The soldiers piled dry straw, hay, and wood around the barn's exterior. They doused everything with gasoline or kerosene. The smell of fuel permeated the air. Then, on command, they set the barn on fire. Flames erupted along all sides of the structure simultaneously. The dry wood and straw ignited instantly, and within seconds, the barn was engulfed in fire. Inside, the temperature rose rapidly. Smoke filled the interior, making it difficult to breathe. Children screamed. People coughed and choked on the toxic fumes. Mothers tried to shield their babies from the smoke, holding them close and covering their faces. The elderly collapsed from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation. As the flames spread across the wooden walls and roof, panic overtook the trapped villagers. People rushed to the walls, trying to find any opening, any way out. Some attempted to kick through the burning planks. Others searched for gaps in the structure. The heat became unbearable. Clothing caught on fire, hair singed, skin blistered from the intense temperature. In a desperate effort to survive, the strongest men in the barn focused on the main door. Despite the nails and planks holding it shut, they threw themselves against it repeatedly. The door was old wood, and under the assault of multiple men pushing together, it began to give way. With a final collective effort, the door burst open, splintering the boards that had been nailed across it. People poured out of the burning barn, gasping for fresh air, their clothes smoking and singed. For a brief moment there was hope. They were out of the inferno. But that hope lasted only seconds. Standing in a semicircle around the barn door were the soldiers of Battalion 118, their rifles and machine guns aimed directly at the exit. As villagers emerged, men, women, and children, the soldiers opened fire. The first people out were cut down immediately, falling in the doorway. Those behind them stumbled over the bodies, only to be shot themselves. A mother carrying an infant was hit multiple times and fell backward into the flames. An elderly man who could barely walk was shot before he could take 3 steps. Children who ran in panic were gunned down within meters of the barn. The shooting was systematic and merciless. The soldiers aimed deliberately, ensuring that no one escaped. Some villagers, realizing the horror awaiting them outside, turned back and tried to re-enter the burning barn, choosing to die in the flames rather than face the bullets. Others collapsed in the doorway from smoke inhalation before the soldiers could shoot them. A few tried to run in different directions, hoping to escape through the smoke and chaos. But the soldiers had positioned themselves strategically, and most were shot down. One witness who survived, a 12-year-old boy named Anton Baranovsky, later described what he saw. He had been shot in the arm, but fell among the bodies and played dead. He watched as soldiers walked among the corpses, checking for survivors and shooting anyone who moved. Within a minute, the shooting stopped. The soldiers had accomplished their goal. Virtually everyone from the barn was dead, either from gunfire, burns, or smoke inhalation. Bodies lay scattered around the barn entrance, many still smoldering. Inside the barn, the few who had not escaped were consumed by the flames.
After the massacre at the barn, the soldiers of Schutzmannschaft Battalion 118 turned their attention to completing the destruction of Khatyn. They went from house to house, looting anything of value – food, livestock, tools, clothing, and personal belongings. What they couldn't carry, they destroyed. Then they systematically set fire to all 26 houses in the village. The wooden structures burned quickly in the March wind. Within hours, the entire village was engulfed in flames. Smoke rose high into the sky, visible for kilometers around. The soldiers stood watching, ensuring that every building was completely destroyed. By evening, Khatyn had been reduced to ashes and charred ruins. The massacre claimed 149 lives total. Among the dead were 75 children under the age of 16, including numerous infants and toddlers. Entire families had been wiped out – grandparents, parents, and children all killed together. Of the village's 26 households, only 3 families had any survivors at all, and those survivors had only lived because they happened to be away from the village when the massacre occurred. But there were 4 survivors from those trapped in the barn, a miraculous number considering the horror they endured. The most well-known survivor was 56-year-old Iosif Kaminsky, the village blacksmith. He had been shot but survived by playing dead among the corpses. When he regained consciousness, he found his son, also named Iosif and only 15 years old, severely wounded and dying. The elder Kaminsky held his son in his arms as the boy died. This image, a father cradling his dying son amid the ruins of their village, became one of the most powerful symbols of the Khatyn tragedy. Another survivor was 12-year-old Anton Baranovsky, who'd been shot in the arm but managed to crawl away and hide in the forest until the soldiers left. 2 other adults, Viktor Zhlobkovich and Alexandra Zhlobkovich, also survived the massacre by hiding under corpses until the battalion departed. These 4 survivors later provided crucial testimony about what happened at Khatyn. After the soldiers left, the survivors emerged from hiding to find their village completely destroyed. The barn was a pile of ashes containing charred human remains. Bodies lay scattered around the site. The houses were burned to the ground. Livestock had been killed or taken. Everything that had been Khatyn was gone. The survivors made their way to nearby villages to report what had happened and seek help. But in war-torn Belarus, there was little help to be had. The survivors eventually joined partisan groups or found shelter with relatives in other areas. The site of Khatyn remained abandoned, its ruins a testament to the massacre. The massacre at Khatyn was horrific, but what makes it even more devastating is that it was not unique. As mentioned earlier, 628 Belarusian villages were completely destroyed along with all their inhabitants during the Nazi occupation. The methods were often similar. Villagers would be locked in barns, churches, or schools and then burned alive. Those who tried to escape were shot. Entire communities were erased in hours. Some of the worst massacres included the villages of Ola, where over 1,800 people were burned alive, Borki, where 2,500 were killed, and Dolginovo, where 3,500 perished. In the Vitebsk region alone, over 10,000 people were burned alive in their villages. The total death toll from these village destruction operations is estimated at several 100,000 people, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. The purpose of these massacres was twofold. First, they were intended as retaliation for partisan activity and as collective punishment to deter villages from supporting the resistance. Second, they were part of the broader Nazi policy of Lebensraum, the idea of clearing Eastern European territories of their Slavic populations to make room for German settlement. In Nazi racial ideology, Slavic peoples were considered Untermenschen, or subhumans, who could be killed without moral consequence. After the war ended in 1945, Soviet authorities began documenting the atrocities committed in Belarus. Investigators interviewed survivors, examined massacre sites, and compiled lists of destroyed villages. The scale of the devastation was almost incomprehensible. In some regions, entire districts had been depopulated. Thousands of children had been orphaned. Entire family lines had been exterminated. The psychological and demographic impact on Belarus would last for generations. Efforts were made to prosecute those responsible for the Khatyn massacre. Soviet investigators identified members of Schutzmannschaft Battalion 118 who had participated in the operation. Some were captured and put on trial. Several were convicted and executed for war crimes. But many members of the battalion escaped justice. They fled westward as Soviet forces advanced, eventually making their way to Western Europe or other countries where they lived under assumed identities.
After World War II, the site of Khatyn remained largely untouched for years. The charred ruins of the village stood as a silent memorial to what had happened there. But by the 1960s, Soviet authorities decided to create a major memorial complex at Khatyn to commemorate not just this one village, but all the Belarusian villages destroyed during the war. In 1969, exactly 26 years after the massacre, the Khatyn Memorial Complex was officially opened. It was designed by architects Yuri Gradov, Valentin Zankovich, and Leonid Levin, and sculptor Sergei Selikhanov. The memorial is one of the most powerful and emotionally moving war memorials in the world. At the center of the complex stands a bronze sculpture of Yosif Kaminsky, the blacksmith who survived the massacre, carrying his dying son in his arms. The statue is larger than life, and Kaminsky's face expresses unbearable grief. This image represents not just one father and son, but all the families destroyed at Khatyn and throughout Belarus. Every 30 seconds, bells ring throughout the memorial. The sound is meant to represent the heartbeat of those who died. Where each of the 26 houses once stood, there is now a symbolic foundation marked by an obelisk resembling a chimney. Each obelisk has a bell that rings periodically, creating a haunting soundscape. A plaque at each site lists the names of the family members who lived in that house and died in the massacre. One of the most moving elements of the memorial is the Cemetery of Villages. It contains 185 urns filled with soil from 185 of the 628 Belarusian villages that were completely destroyed and never rebuilt. Each urn is marked with the village's name. The symbolism is clear. These villages exist now only in memory, their populations exterminated, their physical structures erased. Another powerful element is the Tree of Life, a symbolic sculpture that lists the names of 433 Belarusian villages that were burned down along with their inhabitants, but were later rebuilt. This represents hope and resilience. Though the Nazis tried to destroy them, these communities survived and were reborn. The Wall of Memory features plaques with the names of 260 concentration camps and sites where mass murders occurred throughout Belarus. The sheer number is staggering and illustrates the systematic nature of Nazi atrocities in the region. At the center of the memorial complex burns an eternal flame in memory of all victims. Visitors approach the flame through a symbolic cemetery where 3 birch trees stand. Birches are traditional symbols in Belarusian culture, and their presence evokes the natural landscape that witnessed such horrors. The Khatyn Memorial became one of the most visited sites in the Soviet Union and remains a pilgrimage destination today. For Belarusians, Khatyn represents the suffering of their entire nation during World War II. Every year, on March 22nd, the anniversary of the massacre, ceremonies are held at the memorial. Government officials, veterans, and citizens gathered to remember the victims and to recommit to preventing such atrocities. However, the memory of Khatyn has sometimes been complicated by politics. During the Cold War, Soviet authorities used Khatyn to emphasize Nazi atrocities while downplaying Soviet crimes, including the Khatyn massacre in Poland, where Soviet secret police murdered over 20,000 Polish officers in 1940. Some historians believe Soviet leaders deliberately promoted Khatyn to create confusion with Khatyn and to deflect attention from Soviet crimes. Regardless of these political complications, the historical reality of what happened at Khatyn is undeniable and well documented. The massacre occurred, 149 people died, and the village was erased. This truth is supported by survivor testimony, German and Soviet archives, and physical evidence from the site. For the descendants of survivors and for Belarusians generally, Khatyn carries profound meaning. It represents not just one village, but thousands, not just 149 victims, but hundreds of thousands. It symbolizes the darkest period in Belarusian history and the resilience of a people who survived attempted genocide. The lessons of Khatyn are universal. The massacre demonstrates how collective punishment and retaliation against civilians escalates violence and creates cycles of brutality. It shows how ordinary soldiers, following orders and motivated by ideology, can commit unspeakable atrocities against innocent people, including children. And it reminds us that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield. Entire communities, cultures, and ways of life can be destroyed in hours. Today, as conflicts continue around the world, and as new generations grow up without direct memory of World War II, places like Khatyn serve a crucial function. They are not just memorials to the dead, they are warnings to the living. They remind us that civilization is fragile, that humanity can be lost quickly, and that the protection of innocent life must be a fundamental principle that transcends politics, nationalism, and military objectives. The 149 people who died at Khatyn, the mothers and fathers, the children and elderly, were not soldiers or combatants. They were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, and children. They died simply because they lived in a village near where partisans had attacked a German convoy. Their deaths served no military purpose. They were murdered as a message, as punishment, as terror, and their memory demands that we never forget the cost of hatred, war, and the dehumanization of the enemy.